Chapter 16. He nodded around, his mouth full of hot sandwich. The rest is interesting, and I do have questions about it all. The thought of the Fae being real though, with the winter and summer courts, and Seelie versus Unseelie, and everything they represent. That is the stuff of legends. Finding out that any part of that might be true is mind-blowing. Kaitlyn cocked her head and shifted the transmission into gear, handing her sandwich to Jack to hold until they were fully underway. "I guess I never thought of it that way before," she said at last, taking the food from him at the same time. "It was always just something that I knew to be true. There wasn't any mystery or feeling of awe associated with them." Jack decided to let the subject rest for the moment, and moved on to the questions she had been expecting him to ask. What are the limits of the spell? Does it still work if you do magic right in front of someone? What about last night? How will people who saw that ball of electricity in the air remember it? She shoved the last bite sandwich into her mouth, just as they pulled into the school parking lot. "It differs from person to person," she said after swallowing. "For some, it fades over the course of a few minutes. While for others, it's like waking up and suddenly finding yourself in a different spot than before. The real fun is in how they remember it. The spell doesn't force them to fully forget it. Part of the idea behind it was to help people be more at ease with magic and the unknown." She glanced at the clock on the dash and settled into her seat upon seeing that they still had time before they needed to be back to class. "What do you mean?" he asked when she failed to continue the tale, the last of his sandwich disappearing into his mouth a moment later. Some of the most famous fantasy authors had some interactions with magic in their past. She hinted vaguely while he finished swallowing the food. "Wait," he said as understanding dawned. "You mean some of those stories were real?" "No, not the stories themselves, just certain details that sparked the stories. Haven't you ever wondered why so many different stories across different genres revolved around the Fae and the use of magic?" She glanced at the clock again and opened her door. "I just assumed they were copying someone else who did it before them, because it was interesting," he replied, walking beside her. "And that is the case for some of them, I'm sure. Others though have experienced the real thing and it comes through in their stories." "What about the Fae? Have they been heard from since whenever this took place?" He was talking softly and quickly as they neared the school doors. "Not that I'm aware of. They vanished entirely and haven't been heard from since the days of Merlin." She smiled after dropping one last knowledge bomb on him and opened the doors. "Merlin was real?" he muttered in shock. His mind was filled with even more questions during the remainder of his classes that day. Everything he heard and supposedly learned went in one ear and out the other, without even bothering to stop for directions. He had more interesting subjects occupying the space needed for normal thought. Kaitlyn waved her hand in front of his face and snapped her fingers. He blinked and jerked away as his eyes focused on her. "What?" he asked dully, his mind slow to catch up after being stuck in his thoughts for so long. "It's time to leave. School is over for the week." She crossed her arms across her chest and stared at him. "That means get up so we can leave." He shook his head, clearing it. "I think you broke my mind with the bit about Merlin," he explained, getting out of his chair. "I noticed. I didn't think it would be that big of a reveal." She tugged him along through the crowded halls to their lockers. "It wasn't, at least not really. It was just more of the same thing that happened with the Fae. There are so many stories that I discounted as a kid that I'm now wondering about what parts might be true in them, if any." He rested his head against the cold metal of the locker, letting it close under the pressure. "You could always ask your mom sometime." Her locker closed with a slam, the impact jostling his head. "I'll do it with Penny at some point. She really loves those old legends and myths. You ready to head to my house?" he asked, changing the subject. They dodged through the crowd of teenagers and hurried over to her car. "Do we have any homework today?" Jack asked, sliding into the passenger seat next to her. "Nope," the word popped off her lips. "Good, what about from yesterday?" She tilted her head, thinking. I'm not sure. None of the teachers mentioned us even being absent. In fact, the only one who said anything was Steve." 2 days without homework?" he asked in disbelief. "That is weird. They love giving us homework here." He wasn't complaining about the sudden lack of extra work. He had been barely getting everything done each day lately. We're going to take our training slow today. Make sure that there aren't any lingering issues from the other night for either of us, Kaitlyn said, pulling into his driveway while leaving enough room for his dad's car. I'll ask Mom where she wants us to train. He jumped out of the car with his bag in hand, making it 2 steps towards the door before spinning on his heel. Sorry, I almost forgot my manners. He grinned cheekily as he opened the car door for her. The look she gave him was one he couldn't quite decipher as he helped her from the car. Your mother taught you well, she commented, pausing behind as he unlocked the front door. No, it wasn't my mom. It was my dad who drilled that one into me. If he drilled it into you so well, then how come you haven't done it before? He stumbled and threw his hands into the air, catching them on the lintel. There were reasons. He mumbled with a red face that had nothing to do with his sudden clumsiness. It had been a mostly unconscious action, resulting from his growing feelings for her. Inside the house, he knocked on the closed door of the bedroom that belonged to his parents. Mom, you awake? He called out softly, opening it a crack when she didn't answer. The bed was empty and had already been made, indicating that she had been up for a while by that point. Mom? He called out again, louder this time. I'm in the basement, she called out from below them. Curious as to what she was doing down there, he led the way to the stairs and down into the basement. They never used the space for anything as far as he was aware, and was mostly off limits to him and his sister. It had always been filled with old items from the early days in his parents' marriage. Junk they had never seen fit to throw away, and heirlooms inherited from his dad's grandparents who raised him. Mom, what are you doing down here? He called out at the foot of the stairs. New boxes lined the sides, creating a clear area for them to walk. I'm clearing a space for you to train, and down here is where I have always done mine. The boxes and other junk were just a convenient excuse to keep you kids from coming down here all the time. Her voice led them down the path and into an open area that had previously been concealed from view by the boxes. A large rune made of silver was inset into the concrete floor. Closer to the wall was a second circular rune that had been drawn by hand using chalk, and seemed to refract and distort the light around it. Be careful when stepping into that rune. The chalk will smudge easily. I'll start carving up the concrete later, and lay down a proper version of the rune in silver this weekend. Dust lined his mother's face and covered her clothes. She cracked her neck and thought about what she had said. I guess that means tomorrow, maybe I'll do it on Sunday then. I need to get enough silver first. Does Mom know that you can do this? Kaitlyn asked, standing beside the older completed rune. Eleanor looked away from them. I haven't told her, so no, but if she takes the time to truly think about it, then she'll figure it out. What's going on? Jack asked, not understanding some once more. A feeling that he was quickly growing tired of, and was determined to remedy the first chance he got. Your mother can create meditation runes. She pointed to the chalked version they would be using. And control and energy inhibition runes. She pointed to the silver rune beside her. Eleanor smiled. I didn't think you would recognize what that one was, though you missed the third and fourth function on it. She ran a hand through her dusty hair. It's not like I was trying to hide it or anything. I had just forgotten how big of a deal it was. Only certain people are allowed to lay runes. The training needed is extensive. No, it's extensive if it is going to be your focus. If it is only for training purposes and certain ones for protection, then it isn't nearly as bad. His mother turned to look at them. All nobles must learn how to create and control certain runes for their territories. It is sort of a requirement. Kaitlyn groaned and sank to the floor. That makes so much sense. I can't believe I never realized before now. Jack stepped closer to the swirling lines. What are they used for? The one closest to the wall is for you two and Penelope. It helps the person sitting inside it concentrate and feel their magic as it moves through the body during meditation. It should be especially effective for helping you and her to get a better grasp on your respective controls. His mother said with a smile. The one in silver is for my use and has a few different functions. The two mentioned by Kaitlyn, however, are designed to push the user's limit. It pushes your magic until you can barely control it, making you fight for it constantly. While the other inhibits your magic, which again helps with control. It forces me to refine my energy usage on each spell until I am using no more than is absolutely needed. A situation Kaitlyn has become intimately familiar with from what I understand. Kaitlyn nodded. Mom was able to get a simple circle with that function built at our last house. It was what helped me to refine my control to such a degree. She finished sadly, remembering everything that had happened. Good, then I don't need to explain how to use them, Eleanor said, reaching out and touching the young girl's head. Don't worry about those people. Soon enough, they won't be able to bother you anymore. I know. It's just I thought they were my friends at the time. Kaitlyn climbed to her feet and shook her head. If we are training down here, then where will you be working with Penelope? We'll be using the backyard until dinner, which I have been informed you are making with Jack? At Kaitlyn's nod, she continued. Good, then I will get out of your way and let you get started. Mom, Jack called out before she could leave. Do you have any books on magical society and history? The two of you keep talking about things that I don't understand, and it is getting old quick. She nodded. I'll get some books out and put them in your room for later. With that done, she left them alone, winding her way through the boxes and up the stairs. Kaitlyn waited till they heard her feet hit the stairs, before waving him towards the far circle. Come on, I'll show you where to sit. Be careful not to smudge any of the lines. Paying specific care to the placement of his feet, Jack stepped into the chalked rune circle and sat where she indicated. From there, it was just a matter of her sending a thin tendril of energy into the special chalk used to make the rune, activating it before they joined hands and began their training for the day. Jack felt his body fall away as the meditation circle came into effect. Without his body getting in the way, it was easy to see the fluctuations and movements of energy as it moved through his body and entered his well. In his meditative state, he could follow the energy as it left his body and cycled through Kaitlyn's. Her well was under ever-increasing pressure from his energy, and despite its small size, there was something he found far more interesting. The color of his energy in his mind's eye was a cool green that felt natural, while hers was an electric blue that matched her eyes. What was interesting was how his energy clung to hers, the two mixing together before separating as it came back into his body. His energy was slowly changing hers, making it more compatible with his abundant power. The color never changed, just how easily they mingled and then separated. It was an effect he was sure she had noticed, either before or just now, the same as he had. Together, they went through the training exercises. The deep meditation their minds and bodies were in, helping them to make more progress than before. They lost themselves in the feeling of control and pressure, enjoying the flow they had never before seen or experienced so clearly. The state of concentration Kaitlyn was in kept her own powers under control. Under its effects, she was able to see whenever her energy grew close to her limit of control. When they separated hours later, the runes had faded into ash as the magic burned through the chalk. The meditation circle would have to be redrawn before it could be used again. Kaitlyn's eyes were glowing faintly, providing the sole source of illumination in the gloomy basement. The small window above their heads revealed the orange sky of late afternoon. We should start preparing dinner before it gets too late. I don't want you driving at night. Jack stood and looked down at her. You aren't sparking this time or covered in sweat. The circle helped me stay in control. I was able to see when I was holding too much power and needed to back off on cycling the energy before continuing. She explained, beginning the process of bleeding off the small amount of excess energy that had gathered despite her efforts. The glow in her eyes fading as arcs of bright electricity began to flow from one hand to the next, creating a constant circle of snaps and crackling lightning. The smell of burning ozone flooded the basement as she worked the energy into a ball that floated between her hands. Her hair shot straight out as static electricity filled the air until, with a pop, the glowing orb vanished, and the strands of blonde hair fell back into place. She stood with a sigh and wiped the dust from the seat of her pants. Come on, I think I have the perfect recipe to start with, Jack said, his hand twitching as he repressed the urge to reach for her. What are you thinking? She trailed along behind him as they wound through the path of boxes to the stairs. Tacos, he said simply, regretting not having taken the meat out of the freezer earlier. Working with frozen meat was a slightly different process than when it had been defrosted. She frowned. Tacos? How many steps can be involved in such a simple food? You might be surprised. Besides, it can be an easy recipe to start with. Depending on the recipe you use, that is. Jack led the way up the stairs, feeling the burn in his channels. The The progress he had made that day was surprising and more than a little impressive, to say the least. He was sure that with another time or two in the circle with her, he would be able to grab hold of his energy. Kaitlyn stood to the side as he pulled out the different ingredients and spices they would need for the recipe. Laying everything out on the counter, he showed her what to do and how the toppings needed to be cut. Next to them, the smell of sizzling meat filled the kitchen. He was using the heat from the pan to defrost the frozen meat, breaking it apart as he went. It was only when the meat was broken apart and cooked that they moved on to the next step, taking care to add the spices mixed with tomato sauce and water in the proper order. On the counter, they added the toppings separated in little piles of onion, lettuce, and the red peppers he enjoyed on his tacos. They finished cooking and turned off the stovetop as his mother poked her head in from the back porch. "You done?" she asked, sniffing the air. Kaitlyn frowned, glaring at the pan of sizzling meat. Is this really all there is to cooking? She seemed confused and disappointed. Pretty much. Following a recipe eliminates any guesswork. As long as you follow that, it is usually pretty easy. Except for baking, I always seem to mess up the food whenever I try making something with dough. He handed her a taco shell and began loading his own up with meat and toppings. The front door of the house opened, and a moment later, his father stepped into the kitchen. In one hand, he held their new phones and a small bag with the power supply for Penelope's laptop in the other. "Nice timing," he exclaimed happily as the door to the back porch slid open and they were joined by the girls. "Oh, before I forget," Eleanor sidled up to Kaitlyn. "Would it be possible for you to give me a ride to your house when you leave? Your mother and I have to head out again tonight."